The Nothing Equation by Tom Godwin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alasdair Hill. The Nothing Equation by Tom Godwin. The cruiser vanished back into hyperspace, and he was alone in the observation bubble, 10,000 light-years beyond the galaxy's outermost sun. He looked out the windows at the gigantic sea of emptiness around him, and wondered again what the danger had been that had so terrified the men before him. Of one thing he was already certain. He would find that nothing was waiting outside the bubble to kill him. The first bubble attendant had committed suicide, and the second was a mindless maniac on the earthbound cruiser, but it must have been something inside the bubble that had caused it, or else they had imagined it all. He went across the small room, his magnetized soles loud on the thin metal floor in the bubble's silence. He sat down in the single chair, his weight very slight in the feeble artificial gravity, and reviewed the known facts. The bubble was a project of Earth's Galactic Observation Bureau, positioned there to gather data from observations that could not be made from within the galaxy. Since metallic mass affected the hypersensitive instruments, the bubble had been made as small and light as possible. It was for that reason that it could accommodate only one attendant. The Bureau had selected Horn as the bubble's first attendant, and the cruiser left him there for his 6 months period of duty. When it made its scheduled return with his replacement, he was found dead from a tremendous overdose of sleeping pills. On the table was his daily report log and his last entry, made 3 months before. I haven't attended to the instruments for a long time because it hates us and doesn't want us here. It hates me the most of all and keeps trying to get into the bubble to kill me. I can hear it whenever I stop and listen, and I know it won't be long. I'm afraid of it, and I want to be asleep when it comes. But I'll have to make it soon because I have only 20 sleeping pills left, and if... The sentence was never finished. According to the temperature recording instruments in the bubble, his body ceased radiating heat that same night. The bubble was cleaned, fumigated, and inspected inside and out. No sign of any imicable entity or force could be found. Silverman was Horn's replacement. When the cruiser returned 6 months later bringing him, Green, to be Silverman's replacement, Silverman was completely insane. He babbled about something that had been waiting outside the bubble to kill him, but his nearest to a rational statement was to say once, when he was asked for the 100th time, what he had seen. Nothing! You can't really see it, but you feel it watching you, and you hear it trying to get in to kill you. One time I bumped the wall and, for God's sake, take me away from it! Take me back to Earth! Then he had tried to hide under the captain's desk, and the ship's doctor had led him away. The bubble was minutely examined again, and the cruiser employed every detector device it possessed to search surrounding space for light years in all directions. Nothing was found. When it was time for the new replacement to be transferred to the bubble, he reported to Captain McDowell. Everything is ready, Green, McDowell said. You are the next one. His shaggy grey eyebrows met in a scowl. It would be better if they would let me select the replacement instead of them. He flushed with a touch of resentment and said, That Bureau found my intelligence and initiative of thought satisfactory. I know the characteristics you don't need. What they ought to have is somebody like one of my engine room rustabouts, too ignorant to get scared and too dumb to go nuts. Then we can get a sane report 6 months from now instead of ravings of a maniac. I suggest, he said stiffly, that you reserve judgment until that time comes, sir. And that was all he knew about the danger, real or imaginary, that had driven 2 men into insanity. He would have 6 months in which to find the answer. 6 months minus... He looked at the chronometer and saw that 20 minutes had passed since he left the cruiser. Somehow, it seemed much longer. He moved to light a cigarette, and his metal soles scraped the floor with the same startling loudness he had noticed before. The bubble was as silent as a tomb. It was not much larger than a tomb. A sphere 18 feet in diameter, made of thin sheet steel and crisscrossed outside with narrow reinforcing girders to keep the internal air pressure from rupturing it. The floor under him was 6 feet up from the sphere's bottom, and the space beneath held the air regenerator and waste converter units, the storage batteries, and the food cabinets. The compartment in which he sat contained chair, table, a narrow cot, banks of dials, a remote control panel for operating the instruments mounted outside the hull, a microfilm projector, and a pair of exerciser springs attached to one wall. That was all. There were no means of communication, since a hyperspace communicator would have affected the delicate instruments with its radiations, but there was a small microfilm library to go with the projector, so he should be able to pass away the time pleasantly enough. But it was not the fear of boredom that was behind the apprehension he could already feel touching at his mind. It had not been boredom that had turned Horn into a suicide, and Silverman into... Something cracked sharply behind him, like a gunshot in the stillness, and he leaped to his feet, whirling to face it. It was only a metal reel of data tape that had dropped out of the spectrum analyzer into the storage tray. His heart was thumping fast, and his attempt to laugh at his nervousness sounded hollow and mirthless. Something, inside or outside the bubble, had driven 2 men insane with its threat, and now that he was irrevocably exiled into the bubble himself, he could no longer dismiss their fear as products of their imagination. Both of them had been rational, intelligent men, as carefully selected by the Observation Bureau as he had been. He set in to search the bubble, overlooking nothing. When he crawled down into the lower compartment, he hesitated, then opened the longest blade of his knife, before searching among the dark recesses down there. He found nothing, not even a speck of dust. Back in his chair again, he began to doubt his first conviction. Perhaps there really had been some kind of an invisible force or entity outside the bubble. Both Horn and Silverman had said that it had been trying to get in to kill them. They had been very definite about that part. There were 6 windows around the bubble's walls, set there to enable the attendant to see all the outside mounted instruments and dials. He went to them to look out, one by one, and from all of them he saw the same vast emptiness that surrounded him. The galaxy, his galaxy, was so far away that its stars were like dust. In the other directions, the empty gulf was so wide that galaxies and clusters of galaxies were tiny, feeble specks of light shining across it. All around him was a void so huge that galaxies were only specks in it. Who could know what forces or dangers might be waiting out there? A light blinked, reminding him it was time to attend his duties. The job required an hour, and he was nervous and not yet hungry when he had finished. He went to the exerciser springs on the wall and performed a workout that left him tired and sweating, but which, at least, gave him a small appetite. The day passed, and the next. He made another search of the bubble's interior with the same results as before. He felt almost sure, then, that there was nothing in the bubble with him. He established a routine of work, pastime, and sleep that made the first week pass fairly comfortably, but for the gnawing worry in his mind that something invisible was lurking just outside the windows. Then one day he accidentally kicked the wall with his metal shoe tip. It made a sound like that from kicking a tight-stretched section of tin, and it seemed to him it gave a little from the impact, as tin would do. He realized for the first time how thin it was, how deadly, dangerously thin. According to the specifications he had read, it was only 1/16 of an inch thick. It was as thin as cardboard. He sat down with pencil and paper and began calculating. The bubble had a surface area of 146,500 square inches, and the internal air pressure was 14 pounds to the square inch, which meant that this thin metal skin contained a total pressure of 2,051,000 pounds. 2 million pounds. The bubble in which he sat was a bomb, waiting to explode the instant any section of the thin metal weakened. It was supposed to be an alloy so extremely strong that it had a high safety factor, but he could not believe that any metal so thin could be so strong. It was all right for engineers sitting safely on Earth to speak of high safety factors, but his life depended upon the fragile wall not cracking. It made a lot of difference. The next day, he thought he felt the hook to which the exerciser spring was attached crack loose from where it was welded to the wall. He inspected the base of the hook closely, and there seemed to be a fine, hairline fracture appearing around it. He held his ear to it, listening for any sound of a leak. It was not leaking yet, but it could commence doing so at any time. He looked out the windows at the illimitable void that was waiting to absorb his pitiful little supply of air, and he thought of the days he had hauled and jerked at the springs with all his strength, not realizing the damage he was doing. There was a sick feeling in his stomach for the rest of the day, and he returned again and again to examine the hairline around the hook. The next day, he discovered an even more serious threat. The thin skin of the bubble had been spot-welded to the outside reinforcing girders. Such welding often created hard, brittle spots that would soon crystallize from continued movement, and there was a slight temperature difference in the bubble between his working and the sleeping hours that would daily produce a contraction and expansion of the skin, especially when he had used the little cooking burner. He quit using the burner for any purpose and began a daily inspection of every square inch of the bubble's walls, marking with white chalk all the welding spots that appeared to be definitely weakened. Each day, he found more to mark, and soon the little white circles were scattered across the walls wherever he looked. When he was not working at examining the walls, he could feel the windows watching him, like staring eyes. Out of self-defence, he would have to go to them and stare back at the emptiness. Space was alien, coldly, deadly alien. He was a tiny spark of life in a hostile sea of nothing, and there was no one to help him. The nothing outside was waiting day and night for the most infinitesimal leak or crack in the walls. The nothing that had been waiting out there since time without beginning and would wait for time without end. Sometimes he would touch his finger to the wall and think, "Death is out there, only 1/16 of an inch away." His first fears became a black and terrible conviction. The bubble could not continue to resist the attack for long. It had already lasted longer than it should have. 2 million pounds of pressure wanted out, and all the sucking nothing of intergalactic space wanted in. And only a thin sheet of metal, rotten with brittle welding spots, stood between them. It wanted in. The nothing wanted in. He knew, then, that Horn and Silverman had not been insane. It wanted in, and someday it would get in. When it did, it would explode him and jerk out his guts and lungs. Not until that happened, not until the nothing filled the bubble and enclosed his hideous, turned inside-out body, would it ever be content. He had long since quit wearing the magnetized shoes, afraid the vibration of them would weaken the bubble still more. And he began noticing sections where the bubble did not seem to be perfectly concave, as though the rolling mill had pressed the metal too thin in places and it was swelling out like an overinflated balloon. He could not remember when he had last attended to the instruments. Nothing was important but the danger that surrounded him. He knew the danger was rapidly increasing, because whenever he pressed his ear to the wall, he could hear the almost inaudible tickings and vibrations as the bubble's skin contracted or expanded, and the nothing trapped in search of its empty fingers for a flaw or crack that it could tear into a leak. But the windows were far the worst, with the nothing staring in at him day and night. There was no escape from it. He could feel it watching him, malignant and gloating, even when he hid his eyes in his hands. The time came when he could stand it no longer. The cot had a blanket, and he used that together with all his spare clothes to make a tent stretching from the table to the first instrument panel. When he crawled under it, he found that the lower half of one window could still see him. He used the clothes he was wearing to finish the job, and it was much better than hiding there in the concealing darkness where the nothing could not see him. He did not mind going naked. The temperature regulators in the bubble never let it get too cold. He had no conception of time from then on. He emerged only when necessary to bring more food into his tent. He could still hear the nothing tapping and sucking in its ceaseless search for a flaw, and he made such emergencies as brief as possible, wishing that he did not have to come out at all. Maybe if he could hide in his tent for a long time and never make a sound, it would get tired and go away. Sometimes he thought of the cruiser and wished they would come for him, but most of the time he thought of the thing that was outside, trying to get in to kill him. When the strain became too great, he would draw himself up in the position he had once occupied in his mother's womb and pretend he had never left Earth. It was easier there. But always, before very long, the bubble would tick or whisper, and he would freeze in terror, thinking, "This time, it's coming in." Then one day, suddenly, 2 men were peering under his tent at him. One of them said, "My God, again!" And he wondered what he meant. But they were very nice to him and helped him put on his clothes. Later, in the cruiser, everything was hazy and they kept asking him what he was afraid of. "What was it? What did you find?" He tried hard to think so he could explain it. It was nothing." "What were you and Horn and Silverman afraid of? What was it?" the voice demanded insistently. "I told you," he said. "Nothing." They stared at him, and the haziness cleared a little as he saw they did not understand. He wanted them to believe him because what he told them was so very true. "It wanted to kill us. Please, can't you believe me? It was waiting outside the bubble to kill us." But they kept staring, and he knew they didn't believe him. They didn't want to believe him. Everything turned hazy again, and he started to cry. He was glad when the doctor took his hand to lead him away. The bubble was carefully inspected, inside and out, and nothing was found. When it was time for Green's replacement to be transferred to it, Larkin reported to Captain McDowell. "Everything is ready, Larkin," McDonald said. "You're the next one. I wish we knew what the danger is." He scowled. "I still think one of my rustabouts from the engine room might give us a sane report 6 months from now, instead of the babblings we get from you." He felt his face flush, and he said stiffly, "I suggest, sir, that you would not jump to conclusions until the time comes." The cruiser vanished back into hyperspace, and he was alone inside the observation bubble, 10,000 light-years beyond the galaxy's outmost sun. He looked out of the windows at the gigantic sea of emptiness around him and wondered again what the danger had been that had so terrified the men before him. Of one thing he was already certain. He would find that nothing was waiting outside the bubble to kill him. End of The Nothing Equation by Tom Godwin. Recording by Alasdair Hill. This has been a LibriVox recording.
The Futile Flight of John Arthur Ben by Edward Halibut. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothmann. He forgot the most important rule of time travel. Don't fall asleep. The Futile Flight of John Arthur Ben by Edward Halibut. By putting himself into reverse, the doom-intended man left the 20th century far ahead. 1956 was a good year to get out of. John Arthur Ben watched the roaring 20s go by, and the gay 90s backwards, and wondered how it would be to pilot a riverboat on the Mississippi, or to fight under John Paul Jones. Before he was really aware of it, he was for a speeding second a contemporary of another John, Smith, and thought about the life of the red man before the colonists began changing things around. By that time, the scenery had begun to get monotonous, just shrinking trees, and John Arthur Ben swung over into lateral. Ah, England! There went another namesake, Ben Jonson, and in a very little while he considered slowing down to meet still another. But King Arthur flashed past and into the womb in West Wales, just as John was convulsed by a sneeze. It was quite draughty, and he should have dressed more warmly. And as he stuffed his handkerchief back in his pocket, he caught just a tantalizing glimpse of an interesting Druid ceremony. John Arthur Ben blacked out somewhere in the limbo of the pre-Christian era, as he'd been warned he might. And when he came to, he found himself lying in a rather uncomfortable heap with his head in a mushroom patch. The mushrooms and the trees around him weren't shrinking anymore, so John knew he'd stopped, or at least was going slowly. After a while, he decided he wasn't going at all, and got to his feet. It seemed very pleasant here, in the woods, so he found a fallen tree to sit on, and took a wrapped sandwich and a small vacuum bottle of coffee out of his pocket. When he'd finished his meal, he walked to a stream nearby, rinsed the bottle, tossed the wax paper into the water to be carried away, and pocketed the vacuum bottle. Now, he thought, what? This was scarcely dinosaur country. At this point, a wild boar chased him up a tree. To be killed by a boar would be ignominious after all this, although the animal was well enough tusked to have done the job. And so John Arthur Ben climbed to the highest branch, where the boar's persistence forced him to spend the night. He slept somehow, and, with the closing of his conscious mind, the one that wanted to meet a dinosaur in fatal combat, the conventional subconscious, which also sought suicide, but in a more familiar way, shifted him out of reverse. When he awoke, he was back in 1956, in Philadelphia. Irrevocably, John Arthur Ben knew. He went home and hanged himself in a closet. The end of The Futile Flight of John Arthur Ben by Edward Halibut.
The Chronic Argonauts by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Krista, Zaleski. The Chronic Argonauts by H.G. Wells. Section 1, being the account of Dr. Nebo Gipfel's sojourn in Shathuth, about half a mile outside the village of Shathuth, by the road that goes up over the eastern flank of the mountain called Pennapush to Rustog, is a large farm building known as the Manse. It derives this title from the fact that it was at one time the residence of the minister of the Calvinistic Methodists. It is a quaint, low, irregular erection, lying back some 100 yards from the railway, and now fast passing into a ruinous state. Since its construction in the latter half of the last century, this house has undergone many changes of fortune, having been abandoned long since by the farmer of the surrounding acres for less pretentious and more commodious headquarters. Among others, Miss Carno, the Gallic Sappho, at one time made it her home, and later on an old man named Williams became its occupier. The foul murder of this tenant by his 2 sons was the cause of its remaining for some considerable period uninhabited, with the inevitable consequence of its undergoing very extensive dilapidation. The house had got a bad name, and adolescent man and nature combined to bring swift desolation upon it. The fear of the Williamses, which kept the Shathuth lads from gratifying their propensity to invade its deserted interior, manifested itself in unusually destructive resentment against its external breakables. The missiles with which they at once confessed and defied their spiritual dread left scarcely a splinter of glass and only battered relics of the old-fashioned leaden frames in its narrow windows, while numberless shattered tiles about the house and 4 or 5 black apertures yawning behind the naked rafters in the roof also witnessed vividly to the energy of their rejection. Rain and wind thus had free way to enter the empty rooms and work their will there, old time aiding and abetting. Alternately soaked and desiccated, The planks of flooring and wainscot warped apart strangely, split here and there, and tore themselves away in paroxysms of rheumatic pain from the rust-devoured nails that had once held them firm. The plaster of walls and ceiling, growing green-black with a rain-fed crust of lowly life, parted slowly from the fermenting laths, and large fragments thereof falling down inexplicably in tranquil hours, with loud concussion and clatter, gave strength to the popular superstition that old Williams and his sons were fated to reenact their fearful tragedy until the final judgment. White roses and dædal creepers that Miss Carno had first adorned the walls with spread now luxuriantly over the lichen-filmed tiles of the roof, and in slender, graceful sprays timidly invaded the ghostly cobweb-draped apartments. Fungi, sickly pale, began to displace and uplift the bricks in the cellar floor, while on the rotting wood everywhere they clustered, in all the glory of the purple and mottled crimson, yellow-brown and hepatite. Woodlice and ants, beetles and moths, winged and creeping things innumerable, found each day a more congenial home among the ruins. And after them, in ever-increasing multitudes, swarmed the blotchy toads. Swallows and martins built every year more thickly in the silent, airy upper chambers. Bats and owls struggled for the crepuscular corners of the lower rooms. Thus, in the spring of the year 1887, was nature taking over, gradually but certainly, the tenancy of the old manse. The house was falling into decay, as men who do not appreciate the application of human derelicts to other beings' use would say. Surely and swiftly. But it was destined, nevertheless, to shelter another human tenant before its final dissolution. There was no intelligence of the advent of a new inhabitant in quiet Shathuth. He came without a solitary premonition out of the vast unknown into the sphere of minute village observation and gossip. He fell into the Shathuth world, as it were, like a thunderbolt falling in the daytime. Suddenly, out of nothingness, he was. Rumour, indeed, vaguely averred that he was seen to arrive by a certain train from London, and to walk straight without hesitation to the old manse, giving neither explanatory word nor sign to mortal as to his purpose there. But then the same fertile source of information also hinted that he was first beheld skimming down the slopes of steep Pennapush with exceeding swiftness, riding, as it appeared to the intelligent observer, upon an instrument not unlike a sieve, and that he entered the house by the chimney. Of these conflicting reports, the former was the first to be generally circulated, but the latter, in view of the bizarre presence and eccentric ways of the newest inhabitant, obtained wider credence. By whatever means he arrived, there can be no doubt that he was in, and in possession of the manse, on the 1st of May, because on the morning of that day he was inspected by Mrs. Morgan ap Lloyd-Jones, and subsequently by the numerous persons her report brought up the mountain slope, engaged in the curious occupation of nailing sheet tin across the void window sockets of his new domicile, blinding his house, as Mrs. Morgan ap Lloyd-Jones not inaptly termed it. He was a small-bodied, sallow-faced little man, clad in a close-fitting garment of some stiff, dark material, which Mr. Perry Davies, the Shathuth shoemaker, opined was leather. His aquiline nose, thin lips, high cheek ridges, and pointed chin were all small and mutually well-proportioned, but the bones and muscles of his face were rendered excessively prominent and distinct by his extreme leanness. The same cause contributed to the sunken appearance of the large, eager-looking grey eyes that gazed forth from under his phenomenally wide and high forehead. It was this latter feature that most powerfully attracted the attention of an observer. It seemed to be great beyond all preconceived ratio to the rest of his countenance. Dimensions, corrugations, wrinkled venation were all abnormally exaggerated. Below it, his eyes glowed like lights in some cave at cliff's foot. It so overpowered and suppressed the rest of his face as to give an unhuman appearance almost, to what would otherwise have been an unquestionably handsome profile. The lank black hair that hung unkempt before his eyes served to increase rather than conceal this effect, by adding to the unnatural altitude a suggestion of hydrocephalic projection, and the idea of something ultra-human was furthermore accentuated by the temporal arteries that pulsated visibly through his transparent yellow skin. No wonder, in view even of these things, that among the highly and overly poetical Seremet of Shathuth, the sieve theory of arrival found considerable favour. It was his bearing and actions, however, much more than his personality, that won over believers to the warlock notion of matters. In almost every circumstance of life, the observant villagers soon found his ways were not only not their ways, but altogether inexplicable upon any theory of motives they could conceive. Thus, in a small matter at the beginning, when Arthur Price Williams, eminent and famous in every tavern in Caernarvonshire for his social gifts, endeavoured, in choicest Welsh and even choicer English, to inveigle the stranger into conversation over the sheet tin performance, he failed utterly. Inquisitional supposition, straightforward enquiry, offer of assistance, suggestion of method, sarcasm, irony, abuse, and at last, gage of battle, though shouted with much effort from the road hedge, went unanswered and apparently unheard. Missile weapons, Arthur Price Williams found, were equally unavailing for the purpose of introduction, and the gathered crowd dispersed with unappeased curiosity and suspicion. Later in the day, the swarth apparition was seen striding down the mountain road towards the village, hatless and with such swift width of step and set resolution of countenance, that Arthur Price Williams, beholding him from afar from the Pig and Whistle doorway, was seized with dire consternation, and hid behind the Dutch oven in the kitchen till he was past. Wild panic also smote the schoolhouse, as the children were coming out, and drove them indoors like leaves before a gale. He was merely seeking the provision shop, however, and erupted thenceform after a prolonged stay, loaded with a various armful of blue parcels, a loaf, herrings, pig's trotters, salt pork, and a black bottle, with which he returned in the same swift projectile gait to the manse. His way of shopping was to name, and to name simply, without solitary other word of explanation, civility, or request, the article he required. The shopkeeper's crude meteorological superstitions and inquisitive commonplaces he seemed not to hear, and he might have been esteemed deaf if he had not evinced the promptest attention to the faintest relevant remark. Consequently, it was speedily rumoured that he was determined to avoid all but the most necessary human intercourse. He lived altogether mysteriously, in the decaying manse, without mortal service or companionship, presumably sleeping on planks or litter, and either preparing his own food or eating it raw. This, coupled with the popular conception of the haunting patricides, did much to strengthen the popular superstition of some vast gulf between the newcomer and common humanity. The only thing that was inharmonious with this idea of severance from mankind was a constant flux of crates filled with grotesquely contorted glassware, cases of brazen and steel instruments, huge coils of wire, vast iron and fire-clay implements of inconceivable purpose, jars and phials labelled in black and scarlet, poison, huge packages of books, and gargantuan rolls of cartridge paper, which set in towards his Shathuth quarters from the outer world. The apparently hieroglyphic inscriptions on these various consignments revealed, at the profound scrutiny of Pug Jones, that the style and title of the new inhabitant was Dr. Moses Nebogifel, Ph.D., F.R.S., N.W.R., paid, at which discovery much edification was felt, especially among the purely Welsh-speaking community. Further than this, these arrivals, by their evident unfitness for any allowable mortal use, and inferential diabolicalness, filled the neighbourhood with a vague horror and lively curiosity, which were greatly augmented by the extraordinary phenomena, and still more extraordinary accounts thereof, that followed their reception in the manse. The first of these was on Wednesday, the 15th of May, when the Calvinistic Methodists of Shathuth had their annual commemoration festival, on which occasion, in accordance with custom, dwellers in the surrounding parishes of Rustog, Pendigarin, Caergyshath, St. Erith, and even distant Shenrust, flocked into the village. Popular thanks to Providence were materialized in the usual way, by means of plum bread and butter, mixed tea, terza, consecrated flirtations, kiss in the ring, rough-and-tumble football, and vituperative political speech-making. About 8:30 the fun began to tarnish, and the assembly to break up, and by 9 numerous couples and occasional groups were wending their way in the darkling along the hilly Shathuth and Rustog road. It was a calm, warm night, one of those nights when lamps, gas, and heavy sleep seem stupid ingratitude to the Creator. The zenith sky was an ineffable deep lucent blue, and the evening star hung golden in the liquid darkness of the west. In the north-northwest, a faint phosphorescence marked the sunken day. The moon was just rising, pallid and gibbous over the huge, haze-dimmed shoulder of the Penipus. Against the wan eastern sky, from the vague outline of the mountain slope, the manse stood out black, clear, and solitary. The stillness of the twilight had hushed the myriad murmurs of the day. Only the sounds of footsteps and voices and laughter that came fitfully rising and falling from the roadway, and an intermittent hammering in the darkened dwelling broke the silence. Suddenly a strange whizzing, buzzing whir filled the night air, and a bright flicker glanced across the dim path of the wayfarers. All eyes were turned in astonishment to the old manse. The house no longer loomed a black, featureless block, but was filled to overflowing with light. From the gaping holes in the roof, from chinks and fissures amid tiles and brickwork, from every gap which nature or man had pierced in the crumbling old shell, a blinding blue-white glare was streaming, beside which the rising moon seemed a disk of opaque sulphur. The thin mist of the dewy night had caught the violet glow, and hung, unearthly smoke, over the colourless blaze. A strange turmoil and outcrying in the old manse now began, and grew ever more audible to the clustering spectators, and therewith came clanging loud impacts against the window-guarding tin. Then from the gleaming roof-gaps of the house suddenly vomited forth a wondrous swarm of heteromerous living things, swallows, sparrows, martins, owls, bats, insects in visible multitudes, to hang for many minutes, a noisy, gyring, spreading cloud over the black gables and chimneys, and then slowly to thin out and vanish away in the night. As this tumult died away, the throbbing humming that had first arrested attention grew once more in the listener's hearing, until at last it was the only sound in the long stillness. Presently, however, the road gradually awoke again to the beating and shuffling of feet, as the knots of Rustog people, one by one, turned their blinking eyes from the dazzling whiteness, and, pondering deeply, continued their homeward way. The cultivated reader will have already discerned that this phenomena, which sowed a whole crop of uncanny thoughts in the minds of these worthy folk, was simply the installation of the electric light in the manse. Truly, this last vicissitude of the old house was its strangest one. Its revival to mortal life was like the raising of Lazarus. From that hour forth, by night and day, behind the tin-blinded windows, the tamed lightning illuminated every corner of its quickly changing interior. The almost frenzied energy of the lank-haired, leather-clad little doctor swept away into obscure holes and corners, and common destruction, creeper sprays, toadstools, rose leaves, birds' nests, birds' eggs, cobwebs, and all the coatings and lovingly fanciful trimmings with which that maternal old daughter, Dame Nature, had tricked out the decaying house for its lying-in state. The magneto-electric apparatus whirred incessantly amid the vestiges of the wainscoted dining-room, where once the 18th-century tenant had piously read morning prayer and eaten his Sunday dinner. And in the place of his sacred symbolic sideboard was a nasty heap of coke. The oven of the bakehouse supplied substratum and the material for a forge, whose snorting, panting bellows and intermittent ruddy sparklight and blast made the benighted but Bible-lit Welsh women murmur in liquid cermic as they hurried by. Whose breath kindleth coals, and out of his mouth is a flame of fire. For the idea these good people formed of it was that a tame but occasionally restive Leviathan had been added to the terrors of the haunted house. The constantly increasing accumulation of pieces of machinery, big brass castings, block tin, casks, crates, and packages of innumerable articles, by their demands for space, necessitated the sacrifice of most of the slighter partitions of the house, and the beams and flooring of the upper chambers were also mercilessly sawn away by the tireless scientist, in such a way as to convert them into mere shelves and corner brackets of the arterial space between the cellars and rafters. Some of the sounder planking was utilized in the making of a rude, broad table, upon which files and heaps of geometrical diagrams speedily accumulated. The production of these latter seemed to be the object upon which the mind of Dr. Nebelgifel was so inflexibly set. All other circumstances of his life were made entirely subsidiary to this one occupation. Strangely complicated traceries of lines they were, plans, elevations, sections by surfaces and solids, that, with the help of logarithmic mechanical apparatus and involved curvigraphical machines, spread swiftly under his expert hands over yard after yard of paper. Some of these symbolized shapes he dispatched to London, and they presently returned, realized in forms of brass and ivory and nickel and mahogany. Some of them he himself translated into solid models of metal and wood, occasionally casting the metallic ones in molds of sand, but often laboriously hewing them out of the block for greater precision of dimension. In this second process, among other appliances, he employed a steel circular saw set with diamond powder, and made to rotate with extraordinary swiftness by means of steam and multiplying gear. It was this latter thing, more than all else, that filled Shathuth with a sickly loathing of the doctor as a man of blood and darkness. Often in the silence of midnight, for the newest inhabitant heeded the sun but little in his incessant research, the awakened dwellers around Pennapush would hear what was at first a complaining murmur, like the groaning of a wounded man, grrrr, rising by slow gradations in pitch and intensity, to the likeness of a voice in despairing, passionate protest, and at last ending abruptly in a sharp, piercing shriek that rang in the ears for hours afterward, and begot numberless gruesome dreams. The mystery of all these unearthly noises and inexplicable phenomena, the doctor's inhumanly brusque bearing, and evident uneasiness when away from his absorbing occupation, his entire and jealous seclusion, and his terrifying behavior to certain officious intruders, roused popular resentment and curiosity to the highest, and a plot was already on foot to make some sort of popular inquisition, probably accompanied by an experimental ducking, into his proceedings when the sudden death of the hunchback Hughes in a fit brought matters to an unexpected crisis. It happened in broad daylight, in the roadway just opposite the manse. 6 people witnessed it. The unfortunate creature was seen to fall suddenly and roll about on the pathway, struggling violently, as it appeared to the spectators, with some invisible assailant. When assistance reached him, he was purple in the face, and his blue lips were covered with glary foam. He died almost as soon as they laid hands on him. Owen Thomas, the general practitioner, vainly assured the excited crowd which speedily gathered outside the Pig and Whistle, whither the body had been carried, that the death was unquestionably natural. A horrible zymotic suspicion had gone forth that the deceased was the victim of Dr. Nebelgiffle's imputed aerial powers. The contagion was with the news that passed like a flash through the village, and set all Shathuth seething with a fierce desire for action against the worker of this iniquity. Downright superstition, which had previously walked somewhat modestly about the village, in the fear of ridicule, and the doctor, now appeared boldly before the sight of all men, clad in the terrible majesty of truth. People who had hitherto kept entire silence as to their fears of the imp-like philosopher suddenly discovered a fearsome pleasure in whispering dread possibilities to kindred souls, and from whispers of possibilities their sympathy-fostered utterances soon developed into unhesitating asseverations in loud and even high-pitched tones. The fancy of a captive Leviathan, already alluded to, which had up to now been the horrid but secret joy of a certain conclave of ignorant old women, was published to all the world as indisputable fact, it being stated on her own authority that the animal had on one occasion chased Mrs. Morgan ap Lloyd-Jones almost into Rustog. The story that Nebelgiffle had been heard within the manse chanting, in conjunction with the Williamses' horrible blasphemy, and that a black flapping thing of the size of a young calf had thereupon entered the gap in the roof, was universally believed in. A grisly anecdote that owed its origination to a stumble in the churchyard was circulated to the effect that the doctor had been caught ghoulishly tearing with his long white fingers at a new-made grave. The numerously attested declaration that Nebelgiffle and the murdered Williams had been seen hanging the sons on a ghostly gibbet at the back of the house was due to the electric illumination of a fitfully wind-shaken tree. 100 like stories hurtled thickly about the village and darkened the moral atmosphere. The Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook, hearing of the tumult, sallied forth to allay it, and narrowly escaped drawing on himself the gathering lightning. By 8 o'clock, it was Monday, the 22nd of July, a grand demonstration had organized itself against the necromancer. A number of bolder hearts among the men formed the nucleus of the gathering, and at nightfall Arthur Price Williams, John Peters, and others brought torches and raised their spark-raining flames aloft with curt, ominous suggestions. The less adventurous village manhood came straggling late to the rendezvous, and with them the married women came in groups of 4 or 5, greatly increasing the excitement of the assembly with their shrill, hysterical talk and active imaginations. After these, the children and young girls, overcome by undefinable dread, crept quietly out of the 2 silent and shadowy houses into the yellow glare of the pine knots and the tumultuary noise of the thickening people. By 9, nearly half the Shathuth population was massed before the Pig and Whistle. There was a confused murmur of many tongues, but above all the stir and chatter of the growing crowd could be heard the coarse, cracked voice of the bloodthirsty old fanatic Pritchard, drawing a congenial lesson from the fate of the 450 idolaters of Carmel. Just as the church clock was beating out the hour, an occultly originated movement up the hill began, and soon the whole assembly, men, women, and children, was moving in a fear-compacted mass towards the ill-fated doctor's abode. As they left the brightly lit public house behind them, a quavering female voice began singing one of those grim-sounding canticles that so satisfy the Calvinistic ear. In a wonderfully short time, the tune had been caught up, first by 2 or 3, and then by the whole procession, and the manifold shuffling of heavy shoon grew swiftly into rhythm with the beats of the hymn. When, however, their goal rose like a blazing star over the undulation of the road, the volume of the chanting suddenly dried away, leaving only the voices of the ringleaders, shouting indeed now somewhat out of tune, but if anything more vigorously than before. Their persistence and example nevertheless failed to prevent a perceptible breaking and slackening of the pace. As the manse was neared, and when the gate was reached, the whole crowd came to a dead halt. Vague fear for the future had begotten the courage that had brought the villagers thus far. Fear for the present now smothered its kindred birth. The intense blaze from the gaps in the deathlight silent pile lit up rows of livid, hesitating faces, and a smothered, frightened sobbing broke out among the children. "Well," said Arthur Price Williams, addressing Jack Peters with an expert assumption of the modest discipleship, "what do we do now, Jack?" But Peters was regarding the manse with manifest dubiety and ignored the question. The Shathuth witch find seemed to be suddenly aborting. At this juncture old Pritchard suddenly pushed his way forward, gesticulating weirdly with his bony hands and long arms. "What?" he shouted in broken notes. "Fear ye to smite when the Lord hateth? Burn the warlock!" And, seizing a flambeau from Peters, he flung open the rickety gate and strode on down the drive, his torch leaving a coiling trail of scintillant sparks on the night wind. "Burn the warlock!" screamed a shrill voice from the wavering crowd, and in a moment the gregarious human instinct had prevailed. With an outburst of incoherent, threatening voice, the mob poured after the fanatic. Woe betide the philosopher now. They expected barricaded doors, but with a groan of conscious insufficiency, the hinge-rusted portal swung at the push of Pritchard. Blinded by the light, he hesitated for a second on the threshold, while his followers came crowding up behind him. Those who were there say they saw Dr. Nebelgiffel standing in the toneless electric glare, on a peculiar erection of brass and ebony and ivory, and that he seemed to be smiling at them, half pityingly and half scornfully, as it is said martyrs are wont to smile. Some assert, moreover, that by his side was sitting a tall man, clad in raven's wing, and some even aver that this second man, whom others deny, bore on his face the likeness of the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook, while others declare that he resembled the description of the murdered Williams. Be that as it may, it must now go unproven forever, for suddenly a wondrous thing smote the crowd as it swarmed in through the entrance. Pritchard pitched headlong on the floor senseless, while shouts and shrieks of anger changed in mid-utterance to yells of agonizing fear, or to the mute gasp of heart-stopping horror, and then a frantic rush was made for the doorway. For the calm, smiling doctor and his quiet, black-clad companion and the polished platform which upbore them had vanished before their eyes. Section 2. How an Esoteric Story Became Possible. A silvery foliaged willow by the size of a mirror, Out of the crest-spangled waters below rise clumps of sedge blades, and among them glows the purple fleur-de-lis, the sapphire vapor of forget-me-nots. Beyond is the sluggish stream of water reflecting the intense blue of the moist fenland sky, and beyond that a low osier-fringed eyot. This limits all the visible universe, save some scattered pollards and spear-like poplars showing against the violet distance. At the foot of the willow reclines the author, watching a copper butterfly fluttering from iris to iris. Who can fix the colors of the sunset? Who can take a cast of flame? Let him essay to register the mutations of mortal thought as it wanders from a copper butterfly to the disembodied soul, and thence passes to spiritual motions and the vanishing of Dr. Moses Nebugiffel and the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook from the world of sense. But as the author lay basking there and speculating, as another once did under the boo tree, on mystic transmutations, a presence became apparent. There was a somewhat on the eyot between him and the purple horizon, an opaque reflecting entity, making itself dimly perceptible by reflection in the water to his averted eyes. He raised them in curious surprise. What was it? He stared in stupefied astonishment at the apparition, doubted, blinked, rubbed his eyes, stared again, and believed. It was solid, it cast a shadow, and it upbore two men. There was white metal in it that blazed in the noontide sun like incandescent magnesium, ebony bars that drank in the light, and white parts that gleamed like polished ivory, yet withal it seemed unreal. The thing was not square, as a machine ought to be, but all awry. It was twisted and seemed falling over, hanging in two directions, as those queer crystals called triclinic hang. It seemed like a machine that had been crushed or warped. It was suggestive and not confirmatory, like the machine of a disordered dream. The men, too, were dreamlike. One was short, intensely sallow, with a strangely shaped head, and clad in a garment of dark green. The other was grotesquely out of place, evidently a clergyman of the established church, a fair-haired, pale-faced, respectable-looking man. Once more, doubt came rushing in on the author. He sprawled back and stared at the sky, rubbed his eyes, stared at the willow wands that hung between him and the blue, closely examined his hands to see if his eyes had got any new things to relate about them, and then sat up again and stared at the eyot. A gentle breeze stirred the osiers. A white bird was flapping its way through the lower sky. The machine of the vision had vanished. It was an illusion, a projection of the subjective, an assertion of the immateriality of the mind. Yes, interpolated the skeptic faculty, but how comes it that the clergyman is still there? The clergyman had not vanished. In intense perplexity, the author examined this black-coated phenomena as he stood regarding the world with hand-shaded eyes. The author knew the periphery of that eyot by heart, and the question that troubled him was whence? The clergyman looked as Frenchmen look when they land at New Haven, intensely travel-worn. His clothes showed rubbed and seamy in the bright day. When he came to the edge of the island and shouted a question to the author, his voice was broken and trembled. "Yes," answered the author, "it is an island. How did you get there?" But the clergyman, instead of replying to this, asked a very strange question. He said, "Are you in the 19th century?" The author made him repeat that question before he replied. "Thank heaven!" cried the clergyman rapturously. Then he asked very eagerly for the exact date. "August 9th, 1887, he repeated after the author. "Heaven be praised!" And sinking down on the eyot so that the sedges hid him, he audibly burst into tears. Now the author was mightily surprised at all this, and going a certain distance along the mare, he obtained a punt, and getting into it he hastily pulled to the eyot where he had last seen the clergyman. He found him lying insensible among the reeds, and carried him in his punt to the house where he lived, and the clergyman lay there insensible for 10 days. Meanwhile it became known that he was the Reverend Elijah Cook, who had disappeared from Sidwood with Dr. Moses Nebugiffel 3 weeks before. On August 19th, the nurse called the author out of his study to speak to the invalid. He found him perfectly sensible, but his eyes were strangely bright and his face was deadly pale. "Have you found out who I am?" he asked. "You are the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook, Master of Arts of Pembroke College, Oxford, and Rector of Shethuth, near Rosteg in Caernarvon." He bowed his head. "Have you been told anything of how I came here?" "I found you among the reeds," I said. He was silent and thoughtful for a while. "I have a deposition to make. Will you take it?" "It concerns the murder of an old man named Williams, which occurred in 1862. This disappearance of Dr. Moses Nebelgifel, the abduction of a ward in the year 4003. The author stared. "The year of our Lord, 4003, he corrected. She would come. Also several assaults on public officials in the years 17,901 and 2. The author coughed. "The years 17,901 and 2, and valuable medical, social, and physiographical data for all time." After a consultation with the doctor, it was decided to have the deposition taken down, and this is which constitutes the remainder of the story of the Chronic Argonauts. On August 28, 1887, the Reverend Elijah Cook died. His body was conveyed to Shathuth and buried in the churchyard there. Section 3. The esoteric story based on the clergyman's depositions. The Anachronic Man. Incidentally, it has been remarked in the first part how the Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook attempted and failed to quiet the superstitious excitement of the villagers on the afternoon of the memorable 22nd of July. His next proceeding was to try and warn the unsocial philosopher of the dangers which impended. With this intent, he made his way from the rumor-pelted village, through the silent, slumberous heat of the July afternoon, up the slopes of the Pennapush to the old manse. His loud knocking at the heavy door called forth dull resonance from the interior, and produced a shower of lumps of plaster and fragments of decaying touchwood from the rickety porch. But beyond this, the dreamy stillness of the summer midday remained unbroken. Everything was so quiet as he stood there expectant, that the occasional speech of the haymakers a mile away in the fields, over towards Rustog, could be distinctly heard. The reverend gentleman waited, then knocked again and waited again, and listened, until the echoes and the patter of rubbish had melted away into the deep silence, and the creeping in the blood vessels of his ears had become oppressively audible, swelling and sinking with sounds like the confused murmuring of a distant crowd, and causing a suggestion of anxious discomfort to spread slowly over his mind. Again he knocked, this time loud, quick blows with his stick, and almost immediately afterwards, leaning his hand against the door, he kicked the panels vigorously. There was a shouting of echoes, a protesting jarring of hinges, and then the oaken door yawned and displayed, in the blue blaze of the electric light, vestiges of partitions, piles of planking and straw, masses of metal, heaps of papers and overthrown apparatus, to the rector's astonished eyes. "Dr. Nebelgifel, excuse my intruding," he called out. But the only response was the reverberation among the black beams and shadows that hung dimly above. For almost a minute he stood there, leaning forward over the threshold, staring at the glittering mechanisms, diagrams, books, scattered indiscriminately with broken food, packing cases, heaps of coke, hay, and microcosmic lumber, about the undivided house cavity. And then, removing his hat and treading stealthily as if the silence were a sacred thing, he stepped into the apparently deserted shelter of the doctor. His eyes sought everywhere as he cautiously made his way through the confusion, with a strange anticipation of finding Nebelgifel hidden somewhere in the sharp black shadows among the litter. So strong in him was an indescribable sense of perceiving presence. This feeling was so vivid that when, after an abortive exploration, he seated himself upon Nebelgifel's diagram-covered bench, it made him explain in a forced, hoarse voice to the stillness, "He is not here. I have something to say to him. I must wait for him." It was so vivid, too, that the trickling of some grit down the wall in the vacant corner behind him made him start round in sudden perspiration. There was nothing visible there, but turning his head back, he was stricken rigid with horror by the swift, noiseless apparition of Nebelgifel, ghastly pale, and with red-stained hands, crouching upon a strange-looking metallic platform, with his deep grey eyes looking intently into the visitor's face. Cook's first impulse was to yell out his fear, but his throat was paralyzed, and he could only stare fascinated at the bizarre countenance that had thus clashed suddenly into visibility. The lips were quivering, and the breath came in short, convulsive sobs. The unhuman forehead was wet with perspiration, while the veins were swollen, knotted, and purple. The doctor's red hands, too, he noticed, were trembling, as the hands of slight people tremble after intense muscular exertion, and his lips closed and opened as if he, too, had a difficulty in speaking, as he gasped, "What do you do here?" Cook answered not a word, but stared with hair erect, open mouth, and dilated eyes at the dark red, unmistakable smear that streaked the pure ivory and gleaming nickel and shining ebony of the platform. "What are you doing here?" repeated the doctor, raising himself. "What do you want?" Cook gave a convulsive effort. "In heaven's name, what are you?" he gasped. And then black curtains came closing in from every side, sweeping the squatting dwarfish phantasm that reeled before him into rayless, voiceless night. The Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook recovered his perceptions to find himself lying on the floor of the old manse, and Dr. Nebelgiffel, no longer blood-stained and with all trace of his agitation gone, kneeling by his side and bending over him with a glass of brandy in his hand. "Do not be alarmed, sir," said the philosopher with a faint smile, as the clergyman opened his eyes. "I have not treated you to a disembodied spirit, or anything nearly so extraordinary. May I offer you this?" The clergyman submitted quietly to the brandy, and then stared perplexed into Nebelgiffel's face, vainly searching his memory for what occurrences had preceded his insensibility. Raising himself at last into a sitting posture, he saw the oblique mass of metal that had appeared with the doctor, and immediately all that happened flashed back upon his mind. He looked from this structure to the recluse, and from the recluse to the structure. "There is absolutely no deception, sir," said Nebelgiffel with the slightest trace of mockery in his voice. "I lay no claim to work in matters spiritual. It is a bona fide mechanical contrivance, a thing emphatically of this sordid world. Excuse me, just 1 minute." He rose from his knees, stepped upon the mahogany platform, took a curiously curved lever in his hand, and pulled it over. Cook rubbed his eyes. There certainly was no deception. The doctor and the machine had vanished. The reverend gentleman felt no horror this time, only a slight nervous shock, to see the doctor presently reappear in the twinkling of an eye, and get down from the machine. From that he walked in a straight line with his hands behind his back, and his face downcast, until his progress was stopped by the intervention of a circular saw. Then, turning round sharply on his heel, he said, "I was thinking while I was away. Would you like to come? I should greatly value a companion." The clergyman was sitting hatless on the floor. "I am afraid," he said slowly, "you will think me stupid." "Not at all," interrupted the doctor. "The stupidity is mine. You desire to have all this explained. Wish to know where I am going first. I have spoken so little with men of this age for the last 10 years or more that I have ceased to make due allowances and concessions for other minds. I will do my best, but that I fear will be very unsatisfactory. It is a long story. Do you find that floor comfortable to sit on? If not, there is a nice packing case over there, or some straw behind you, or this bench. The diagrams are done with now, but I am afraid of the drawing pins. You may sit on the Chronic Argonauts." "No, thank you," slowly replied the clergyman, eyeing that deformed structure thus indicated suspiciously. "I am quite comfortable here." "Then I will begin. Do you read fables, modern ones?" "I'm afraid I must confess to a good deal of fiction," said the clergyman deprecatingly. "In Wales, the ordained ministers of the sacraments of the Church have perhaps too large a share of leisure. Have you read The Ugly Duckling?" "Hans Christian Andersen's, yes, in my childhood." "A wonderful story, a story that has ever been full of tears and heart-swelling hopes for me, since first it came to me in my lonely boyhood and saved me from unspeakable things. That story, if you understand it well, will tell you almost all that you should know of me, to comprehend how that machine came to be thought of in a mortal brain. Even when I read that simple narrative for the first time, 1,000 bitter experiences had begun the teaching of my isolation among the people of my birth. I knew the story was for me. The ugly duckling that proved to be a swan, that lived through all contempt and bitterness to float at last sublime. From that hour forth I dreamt of meeting with my kind, dreamt of encountering that sympathy I knew was my profoundest need. 20 years I lived in that hope, lived and worked, lived and wandered, loved even, and at last despaired. Only once among all those millions of wandering, astonished, indifferent, contemptuous, and insidious faces that I met with in that passionate wandering, looked one upon me as I desired, looked. He paused. The Reverend Cook glanced up into his face, expecting some indication of the deep feeling that had sounded in his last words. It was downcast, clouded, and thoughtful, but the mouth was rigidly firm. In short, Mr. Cook, I discovered that I was one of those superior caggots called a genius, a man born out of my time, a man thinking the thoughts of a wiser age, doing things and believing things that men now cannot understand, and that in the years ordained to me there was nothing but silence and suffering for my soul. Unbroken solitude, man's bitterest pain. I knew I was an anachronic man. My age was still to come. One filmy hope alone held me to life, a hope to which I clung until it had become a certain thing. 30 years of unremitting toil and deepest thought among the hidden things of matter and form and life. And then that, the Chronic Argo, the ship that sails through time. And now I go to join my generation, to journey through the ages till my time has come. Section 4. The Chronic Argo. Dr. Nebelgifel paused, looked in sudden doubt at the clergyman's perplexed face. You think that sounds mad, he said, to travel through time? It certainly jars with accepted opinions, said the clergyman, allowing the faintest suggestion of controversy to appear in his intonation, and speaking apparently to the Chronic Argo. Even a clergyman of the Church of England, you see, can have a suspicion of illusions at times. It certainly does jar with accepted opinions, agreed the philosopher cordially. It does more than that. It defies accepted opinions to mortal combat. Opinions of all sorts, Mr. Cook. Scientific theories, laws, articles of belief, or, to come to elements, logical premises, ideas, or whatever you like to call them. All are, from the infinite nature of things, so many diagrammatic caricatures of the ineffable, caricatures altogether to be avoided save where they are necessary in the shaping of results, as chalk outlines are necessary to the painter and plans and sections to the engineer. Men, from the exigencies of their being, find this hard to believe. The Reverend Elijah Ulysses Cook nodded his head with the quiet smile of one whose opponent has unwittingly given a point. It is as easy to come to regard ideas as complete reproductions of entities as it is to roll off a log. Hence it is that almost all civilized men believe in the reality of the Greek geometrical conceptions. Oh, pardon me, sir, interrupted Cook. Most men know that a geometrical point has no existence in matter, and the same with a geometrical line. I think you underrate. Yes, those things are recognized, said Nebelgifel calmly. But now a cube. Does that exist in the material universe? Certainly. An instantaneous cube? I don't know what you intend by that expression. Without any other sort of extension. A body having length, breadth, and thickness exists. What other sort of extension can there be? Asked Cook with raised eyebrows. Has it never occurred to you that no form can exist in the material universe that has no extension in time? Has it never glimmered upon your consciousness that nothing stood between men and a geometry of 4 dimensions, length, breadth, thickness, and duration, but the inertia of opinion, the impulse from the Levantine philosophers of the Bronze Age? Putting it that way, said the clergyman, it does look as though there was a flaw somewhere in the notion of tridimensional being. But, he became silent, leaving that sufficiently eloquent but to convey all the prejudice and distrust that filled his mind. When we take up this new light of a 4th dimension, and re-examine our physical science in its illumination, continued Nebelgifel after a pause, we find ourselves no longer limited by hopeless restriction to a certain beat of time, to our own generation. Locomotion along lines of duration, chronic navigation, comes within the range first of geometrical theory, and then of practical mechanics. There was a time when men could move only horizontally and in their appointed country. The clouds floated above them unattainable things, mysterious chariots of those fearful gods who dwelt among the mountain summits. Speaking practically, men in those days were restricted to motion in 2 dimensions, and even their circumambient ocean and hyperborean fear bound him in. But those times were to pass away. First the keel of Jason cut its way between the Symplegades, and then in the fullness of time Columbus dropped anchor in a bay of Atlantis. Then man burst his bi-dimensional limits and invaded the 3rd dimension, soaring with Montgolfier into the clouds, and sinking with a diving bell into the purple treasure caves of the waters. And now another step, and the hidden past and unknown future are before us. We stand upon a mountain summit with the plains of the ages spread below. Nebelgipfel paused and looked down at his hearer. The Reverend Elijah Cook was sitting with an expression of strong distrust on his face. Preaching much had brought home certain truths to him very vividly, and he always suspected rhetoric. "Are those things figures of speech?" he asked, "or am I to take them as precise statements? Do you speak of traveling through time in the same way as one might speak of omnipotence making his pathway on the storm? Or do you, mean what you say?" Dr. Nebelgipfel smiled quietly. "Come and look at these diagrams," he said, and then, with elaborate simplicity, he commenced to explain again to the clergyman the new quadridimensional geometry. Insensibly, Cook's aversion passed away, and seeming impossibility grew possible, now that such tangible things as diagrams and models could be brought forward in evidence. Presently he found himself asking questions, and his interest grew deeper and deeper, as Nebelgipfel slowly and with precise clearness unfolded the beautiful order of his strange invention. The moments slipped away unchecked as the doctor passed on to the narrative of his research, and it was with a start of surprise that the clergyman noticed the deep blue of the dying twilight through the open doorway. "The voyage," said Nebelgipfel, concluding his history, "will be full of undreamt of dangers. Already in one brief essay I have stood in the very jaws of death. But it is also full of the divine's promise of undreamt of joy. Will you come? Will you walk among the people of the golden years?" But the mention of death by the philosopher had brought flooding back to the mind of Cook all the horrible sensations of that first apparition. "Dr. Nebelgipfel, one question." He hesitated. "On your hands, was it blood?" Nebelgipfel's countenance fell. He spoke slowly. "When I had stopped my machine, I found myself in this room as it used to be. Hark! It is the wind in the trees towards Rustag." It sounded like the voices of a multitude of people singing. "When I had stopped, I found myself in this room as it used to be. An old man, a young man, and a lad were sitting at a table reading some book together. I stood behind them unsuspected. 'Evil spirits assailed him,' read the old man. 'But it is written, to him that overcometh shall be given life eternal.' They came as entreating friends, but he endured through all their snares. They came as principalities and powers, but he defied them in the name of the King of Kings. Once even it is told that in his study, while he was translating the New Testament into German, the evil one himself appeared before him. Just then the lad glanced timorously around, and with a fearful wail fainted away. The others sprang at me. It was a fearful grapple. The old man clung to my throat, screaming, 'Man or devil, I defy thee!' I could not help it. We rolled together on the floor. The knife his trembling son had dropped came into my hand. 'Hark!' He paused and listened, but Cook remained staring at him in the same horror-stricken attitude he had assumed when the memory of the blood-stained hands had rushed back over his mind. 'Do you hear what they are crying? Hark! Burn the warlock! Burn the murderer! Do you hear? There is no time to be lost. Slay the murderer of cripples! Kill the devil's claw! Come, come!' Cook, with a convulsive effort, made a gesture of repugnance and strode to the doorway. A crowd of black figures roaring towards him in the red torchlight made him recoil. He shut the door and faced Nebelgipfel. The thin lips of the doctor curled with a contemptuous sneer. "They will kill you if you stay," he said, and seizing his unresisting visitor by the wrist, he forced him towards the glittering machine. Cook sat down and covered his face with his hands. In another moment the door was flung open, and old Pritchard stood blinking on the threshold. A pause, a hoarse shout changing suddenly into a sharp, shrill shriek, a thunderous roar like the bursting forth of a great fountain of water. The voyage of the Chronic Argonauts had begun. End of The Chronic Argonauts by H.G. Wells.
The Course of Empire by Richard Wilson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothmann. Mars' sands are red. Earth's face is too. We were too green, and now we're blue. Course of Empire by Richard Wilson. The older man sat on the grassy bank on the hill overlooking the orchard. The autumn sun was bright, but the humidity was low, and there was a breeze. The younger man sprawled next to him. "Cigarette?" he asked. "Thanks," said Roger Boynton. He looked across the valley, past the apple trees to the fine, white-columned house on the hill beyond. He smiled reminiscently. "A friend of mine once owned that house, a fellow commissioner in world government. He and I used to sit on this very hill sometimes. We'd munch on an apple or two that we'd picked on our way through the orchard. Wine saps, they're called." "You were telling me about the colonizing," said Alasdair gently after a pause. The older man sighed. "Yes." He put out the cigarette carefully, stripping it, scattered the tobacco, and wadded the paper into a tiny ball. "I was Commissioner of Colonies. I had to decide, after my staff had gathered all the data, who would be the best man to put in charge. It was no easy decision. I can imagine. You can't really. There were so many factors, and the data were actually quite skimpy. The way it worked out, to be candid with you, was on the basis of the best guess. And some of the guesses were pretty wild. We knew Mars was sandy, for instance, so we put a Bedouin in charge. That pleased the Middle East in general, and Jordan in particular. Jordan donated 1,000 camels under .4.4. "I beg your pardon," said Alasdair. "That's not double talk. .4 is the old terrestrial program for underdeveloped countries. World government adopted it and broadened it. Mars is the 4th planet, so..." He traced 4.4 in the air, stabbing a finger at the imaginary point. .4.4. It was undoubtedly somebody's little whimsy at the beginning, but then it became accepted for the descriptive term that it was. "I see." The younger man looked vague. He stubbed out his cigarette carelessly, so that it continued to smolder in the grass. "Venus was the rainy planet," Boynton said, looking with disapproval at the smoking butt, though he did nothing about it. "So we put an Englishman in charge. England sent a crate of alligators." The young man looked startled. "Alligator raincoats," Boynton said. "Things weren't very well organized. Too many things were happening too fast. There was a lot of confusion, and although the countries wanted to do what was best, no one knew exactly what that was. So they improvised as best they could on the basis of their little knowledge." "Wasn't it a dangerous thing?" "A little knowledge? No, not dangerous, just inefficient. Then there was Jupiter. We didn't bother about Mercury, although, for a time, there was some uninformed talk about sending an equatorial African to do what he could." "Who went to Jupiter?" Alasdair asked. "The United States clamored for Jupiter and got it. The argument was that the other planets would be a cinch to colonize because of their similarity to Earth, but that Jupiter needed a real expert because it had only its surface of liquid gas and the red spot." "What's that?" "I'm sorry. I forgot you were just a youngster when all of this was going on. The red spot is the Jovian space platform. They built it a long time ago, and then they retrogressed, the way people do, and forgot how they'd done it. Earth sent an engineer to see if it could be done again. The spot was pretty overpopulated, and no real job of colonization could be done until we built one more." "And did you?" "Well, we started to. Before we could really go to work anywhere, though, we had to solve the language problem. An Australian went to work on that. He'd had a background in Melanesian Pidgin, and if anyone was suited to the job of cross-breeding 4 languages into one, he was. 4 languages? Yes, English was the official language of Earth. Then there was Martian, Venusian Chat-Chat, and Spottian. It was a queer amalgam, but it could be understood by everyone, more or less. So that's where it came from. Chicka up chat too much, eh? Interplanetary bêche de mer. Exactly. Only of course it was bêche de space. Me too, fella. Vim ketchum pajong byam by. But even after the language difficulty was solved, we had our troubles. They already had camels on Mars, for instance, and the Martians were amazed when we brought in more, particularly because theirs were wild and semi-intelligent, and the first thing the Martian camels did was come over and liberate their brothers from Earth. They never did come back. Same sort of thing with the raincoats on Venus. It doesn't rain down there, as we know now. It sort of mists up from the ground, soaks up under the raincoat in no time. These were just petty annoyances, of course, but they were symptomatic of the way our half-baked plan operated. You didn't know about the people of Ganymede then? No, we were so busy trying to build another red spot that we never did get to Jupiter's satellites. Oh, it was partly a matter of appropriations, too. The Budget Commission kept explaining to us that there was only so much money, and that we'd better show a profit on what we had before we put in requests to go tooling off to colonize some new place. I guess the Medians first came when you were about 10. 11, the younger man said. They scouted our colonies and came directly to Earth. They took right over and colonized us. A Median overseer climbed the hill effortlessly. He was tall and tentacled, and the breathing apparatus over his head gave him the appearance of a mechanical man. Keeg, Penis, the Median said. You two fella all same chat too much. Befava belong work. He stop long orchard pick 'em apple. The 2 men stood up and obediently walked down the hill toward the apple orchard. Why does he have to talk to us in that pidgin? The young man asked. They all speak English as well as you and I do. It's insulting. That's why they do it, I think, said Boynton, the former commissioner of colonies. They're so much better at colonizing than we were that I guess they feel they have the right to rub it in. The Median had overheard them. Damn right, he said. The end of Course of Empire by Richard Wilson.